Bodies dragged from their homes, churches bombed, children terrified into silence by the thunder of explosions and talks of a racial war, neighbors spying on neighbors, men in uniform barging into homes while parades of masked figures march through towns. This is not Nazi Germany, nor fascist Italy. These events unfold under the stars and stripes, at the very heart of the so-called land of the free and the home of the brave. Welcome to Season 1 of TimeGhost Cold War coverage in our series War to War, where we cover the events of the decade after World War II that brought man from the brink of destruction to the threshold of the stars. I am Sebastian Brandstetter. In late December 1865, 6 young men, mostly former Confederate officers and sons of local elites, gather in the small town of Pulaski near the Alabama-Tennessee border. Seeking amusement and fraternity, they decide to form a club. For inspiration, they turn to the Greek word kuklos, meaning circle. Playing around with the sound, they settle on Ku Klux. And like many other clubs of the time, they then add the word Klan. Little do they know that today is the day, as David Mark Chalmers will later say, when the first American terrorist organization, the Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK, is born. In less than a few months, they attract significantly more members than they thought. One of the things that catches the eye of people is how the Klan dresses. Those white, ghastly, ghost-like figures who claim they haven't drunk a drop of water for years, meet in secret, conduct rituals, and wear strange disguises as they ride on through the night. It is this very absurdity that provides entertainment for the members, but they soon also discover a darker potential. Their appearance also terrifies the newly freed African Americans, who are not used to seeing masked riders claiming to be spirits risen from the battlefields of the Confederacy. What begins as rough play gradually assumes a character of intimidation, and Pulaski Club becomes the mother den of what will spread across the whole South. By 1867, the Klan's growth demands coordination. Delegates gather in Nashville, Tennessee, and adopt a constitution that formally transforms the club into what we can call an invisible empire. They elect former Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest as imperial wizard and create an elaborate hierarchy of realms, dominions, provinces, and dens, each presided over by grand dragons, titans, giants, and cyclopses. The ordinary members call themselves ghouls. On paper, this new order reflects discipline and purpose. The Klan swears oaths of secrecy and allegiance, and it claims as its mission the defense of the weak and the upholding of the Constitution. For white Southerners who see their society overturned, the Klan becomes a vehicle of resistance. Its discipline is less about centralized command and more about shared assumptions that the old order must be restored, chiefly amongst which that Black Americans must be returned to slavery and that the Republican Northern Authority must be broken in the South. But the Klan does not restrict its wrath to freed men. White Republicans deride it as carpetbaggers when they come from the North, and as scalawags when they are Southern-born, are also targets. Northern teachers who establish schools for Black children are flogged or driven out. Judges, officials, and election workers who register Black voters or enforce Reconstruction laws are intimidated, assaulted, or even killed. By striking at these figures, the Klan aims to cripple the machinery of the Republican government in the South and to make Reconstruction unworkable. Towards these ends, within 2 years, the KKK has spread across almost the entire South, although exact membership figures are hard to come by. The oath of secrecy and loyalty to order replaces obedience to the Reconstruction courts, allowing Klansmen to strike with impunity, and from now on, late 1867, the Klan turns into a fully violent organization. It threatens, exiles, flogs, mutilates, shoots, stabs, and hangs its victims. This, combined with the fact that the Klan does not have a solid central command for either operations or decision-making, results in devastating, seemingly arbitrary, and unhindered acts of violence. But then, in 1869, Nathan Bedford Forrest, the Grand Wizard himself, calls for the Klan's disbandment, warning that it has slipped into the hands of the lawless and the brutal. Many supporters withdraw, leaving behind the rougher and reckless elements. Already centralized only in name, afterwards the so-called Invisible Empire splinters into countless local bands, each cloaking itself in the mystique of the Pulaski founders, each insisting it is the true clan, yet all increasingly ungovernable at the same time. What remains is a fractured, chaotic movement, disorganized, discredited, and drained of much of its original strength. But is this the end of the Ku Klux Klan? Well, yes and no, because while the Klan will eventually disappear, this is just its first incarnation. This is merely the end of the first Klan. Why? Because of the release of D.W. Griffith's film, The Birth of a Nation, which glorifies the Reconstruction Klan as saviors of white civilization in 1915. The movie revives the Klan's legend and inspires William J. Simmons, a failed minister and fraternal enthusiast from Alabama, to rekindle what he sees as the glory of times past. On Thanksgiving night, 1915, Simmons gathers a handful of men on Stone Mountain in Georgia, where they burn a cross to herald the rebirth of the Invisible Empire. At the same time, the southern states follow the same worldview and build an entire system of laws and customs to enforce racial separation, known collectively as Jim Crow laws. These statutes mandate segregated schools, transportation, housing, and public facilities, while also restricting black voting rights. Jim Crow was the legal framework of white supremacy, and the Klan functions as its violent partner, intimidating those who challenge segregation and reinforce the lines the law had drawn. Putting Black Americans back in their place remains the central pillar of the KKK in the new century. And the second Klan, unlike the first Klan, which was born in lawless times, is deliberately organized as a national movement. It designs it as both a fraternal order and a crusade for 100% Americanism. Its appeal is broad. It preaches loyalty to white, native-born Protestant values at a time when millions of new immigrants arrive from Europe, when Catholicism and Judaism expand their presence in the United States, and when urban life seems to threaten the small-town Puritan world. So, the Klan of the 20s is not confined to the South. It also flourishes in Indiana, Ohio, Oregon, Colorado, and beyond. At its mid-1920s peak, the Second Klan counts over 4 million members, helps elect governors and US senators, dominates many local offices, and stages mass parades in cities nationwide, including tens of thousands marching down Washington's Pennsylvania Avenue in 1925. The Second Klan also makes anti-Catholicism a signature cause. This is new compared to the first Klan. In the 1910s and 1920s, millions of European Catholic immigrants arrive in American cities. The Klan portrays Catholicism as un-American, authoritarian, and incompatible with democracy. Priests and parochial schools are accused of trying to subvert Protestant culture. Anti-Catholicism becomes a powerful rallying cry in places like Indiana, Ohio, and Oregon, where the Klan pushes for laws to close Catholic schools and keep Catholics out of public office. The Jewish community also becomes a primary target now. The Klan insists that Jews undermine Christian civilization, dominate finance, and spread radical ideas. Anti-Semitism runs through the Klan's newspapers, speeches, and rituals, linking Jewish influence to modernism, urban corruption, and even Bolshevism, where eugenicists dressed hate in lab talk and charts. The Second Klan wrapped it in rite and spectacle. Anti-Semitism sold as exorcism, not with evidence. Its sheets cast Jews as the hidden motor of modern decay, and the cure is pageant and menace, not proof. Nevertheless, its internal glue remains fraternal ritual, secrecy, and the promise of belonging, and its outward mission is still exclusion and subjugation. It still thrives on fear and on the sense that traditional communities are under siege, but the targets are expanding. They inherit the hate from the first clan, but also go against the newly arrived unfit. But eventually the second clan also dies. Not because its message fades, but because its own contradictions consume it. Greed and corruption undermine its leadership, as Simmons and his successors exploit the order for profit. In its collapse, the second clan shows both the volatility of its power and the rawness of its voice, a force too violent to endure and too vulgar to mask itself in the respectability it so desperately craves. Political ambition draws the clan into party battles where it fails to deliver unity. Most damaging, though, is the exposure of its violence and immorality to the public. In 1925, Indiana's powerful leader Stevenson is convicted of kidnapping and raping a young woman who died from her injuries. His trial reveals deep corruption and brutality, driving many members away. Nationwide, the Klan unravels in factional disputes, scandals, and waning enthusiasm. By the Great Depression, the once massive order has shrunk to a fraction of its size, its robe marked more by disgrace than glory. With World War II and the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the Klan's position only worsens. Its hatred of Catholics and Jews, along with sympathy for the German-American Bund and other fascist groups, draws federal scrutiny. In 1944, the IRS sues for unpaid taxes, bankrupting the national organization. Public opinion, already hostile to divisive hate groups during wartime unity, turns sharply against it. If you want to know more about the German-American Bund and other fascist groups, you can also check out Between Two Wars series right here on the TimeGhost channel. But if you think this ends the Klan, again, you are mistaken. After World War II, a third Klan rises when the Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education orders desegregation of public schools in 1954. This ruling sparks Southern resistance. While many white leaders form non-violent groups, like the White Citizens Councils, the Klan reemerges as the violent edge of that opposition. Until then, US schools, especially in the South, operated under the separate but equal doctrine of Plessy v. Ferguson from 1896. In practice, schools were separate but far from equal. White children attended well-funded schools with better facilities and resources, while black children were relegated to overcrowded, underfunded schools with hand-me-down books. Segregation, enforced by law in the South and by custom in much of the North, reinforced racial hierarchy, teaching black children subordination and white children privilege. The Brown v. Board of Education decision declares schools segregation unconstitutional. Chief Justice Earl Warren writes that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal, in a follow-up ruling, Brown 2 from 1955. The court orders desegregation to proceed with all deliberate speed. This ruling fundamentally changes the legal landscape. On paper, it dismantles the legal basis for segregated schools and affirms that black children have the same right to quality education as white children. And although this decision boosts the Klan's popularity rapidly, the roots of the Third Klan stretch back to 1946, when Dr. Samuel Green, an Atlanta physician, once more revives the Klan with cross burnings on Stone Mountain in Georgia. But when Green suddenly dies in 1949, the movement fragments into rival groups. But then, the Brown decision provides the fuel for a true resurgence. The Third Klan thrives on the fear that integration will overturn the racial and social order, and it directly aims its fury at African Americans who demand equal rights, as well as white activists and allies. This Klan operates in a fragmented, decentralized manner, unlike the more unified Second Klan of the 20s, more like the First Klan of the 19th century. Its structure is instead marked by multiple rival groups, each adopting the familiar robes and rituals, often under the control of local strongmen who mix mystique with brutality. Violence once again becomes a defining feature. Floggings, bombings, and murders from the core of its campaign of terror. Black churches and schools are bombed. Civil rights workers are attacked, and targeted assassinations spread fear across communities. But how does the American public of the mid to late 1950s see the Klan? Well, it's complicated, as Henry Louis Mencken, an American journalist, writes. Not a single solitary sound reason has yet been advanced for putting the Ku Klux Klan out of business. If the Klan is against the Jews, so are half of the good hotels of the Republic and 3/4 of the good clubs. If the Klan is against the foreign-born or the hyphenated citizen, so is the National Institute of Arts and Letters. If the Klan is against the Negro, so are all of the states south of the Mason-Dixon line. If the Klan is for damnation and persecution, so is the Methodist Church. If the Klan is bent upon political control, so are the American Legion and Tammany Hall. If the Klan conducts its business in secret, so do all college Greek letter fraternities and the Department of State. If the Klan holds idiotic parades in the public streets, so do the police, the letter carriers, and firemen. And if the Klan's officers bear ridiculous names, so do the officers of the Lambs Club. If the Klan uses the males for shaking down suckers, so does the Red Cross. If the Klan constitutes itself a censor of private morals, so does the Congress of the United States. If the Klan lynches a Moor for raping someone's daughter, so would you or I. You see, Mencken does not support the Klan, but he uses savage satire to give us an idea that the majority of American society doesn't actually hate what the Klan does. If anything, they hate parts of the Klan, but not its entirety. Within this environment, certain leaders become symbols of the Klan's attempt to merge vigilantism with political resistance. And one of the most prominent ones is Robert Shelton of Alabama. Born in 1929, Shelton works as a tire builder in Tuscaloosa before rising to prominence as a Klan organizer 3 decades later. He's not flamboyant, nor especially eloquent, but he's steady and methodical. Under his guidance, the United Klans of America emerges as the largest and most powerful Klan faction of the era. Shelton works hard to project an image of discipline and legitimacy. He issues press statements, oversees large rallies, and insists that his Klan is not a gang of hoodlums, but a patriotic society defending white rights. Never mind that his organization is directly linked to acts of violence, including several bombings of Catholic churches. But with the changing American society and learning from the failures of the past, the Klan also needs to present itself as more than a violent organization run by mobs. On the surface, it maintains the same mass fraternity of cross burnings and midnight rides, but its leaders are more careful to frame it as something larger, as a resistance movement. And that language is very much deliberate. By calling themselves resistance, Klansmen seek to cloak their vigilantism and wanton violence in the aura of patriotism and duty. They argue that they are defending white Southerners from the twin evils of federal overreach and racial integration, while also linking their struggle to the Cold War by casting civil rights activism as part of international communism. Their language also tends to fit the new society. For example, the word Jew appears less and less, and is slowly but steadily replaced by the word Zio, meaning Zionist. As I just touched upon, another core theme the Klan seizes upon in the 1950s is the fear of communism. In the shadow of the Cold War, when Joseph McCarthy thunders about traitors in the State Department and the Second Red Scare consumes the nation, communist becomes a catch-all accusation, a weapon as potent as any gun. It is really ironic. The Republican Party, the sworn enemy of the first Klan, now serves as a shield they can hide behind. The Klan is quick to exploit this Cold War climate. Civil rights activists are smeared as dupes or agents of Moscow, with organizations like the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, branded as tentacles of the Soviet Kraken. Klansmen, this framing is not just propaganda but a vital alibi. It transforms them, at least in their own eyes, from vigilantes in the backwoods to soldiers in a world historic struggle to save America from destruction. Civil rights protests, from sit-ins to marches, are recast as proof of a vast communist Jewish conspiracy bent on overthrowing white Christian mankind. Klan speakers rarely say that black demonstrators are acting on their own convictions. Instead, they insist that the unrest is orchestrated by outside agitators, communist organizers, and Jewish conspirators manipulating events behind the curtain. And when Southern governors and senators themselves denounce integration as a communist plot, the Klan finds vindication. Its rhetoric suddenly sounds less like fringe hatred and more like an echo of respectable politics, blurring the line between mob terror and Cold War orthodoxy. By draping themselves in an anti-communist cloak, Klansmen can align with the most powerful anxiety of the age. They present themselves as defenders of the flag, the Constitution, the Bible, and 100% Americanism, recasting night rides and cross burnings as acts of national defense. For a member who's a day laborer, a mechanic, or a struggling shopkeeper, men who feel their social standing slipping in a changing South, calling himself an anti-communist fighter offers honor, purpose, and meaning. The oath he swears, the robe he wears, and the fiery speeches he hears reinforce the fantasy that he is a frontline warrior in the global war against communism. The Klan also uses anti-communism as a shield against scrutiny. When the FBI investigates bombings or when journalists expose lynchings, Klan leaders retort that the true criminals are not hooded men, but the red-inspired agitators stirring unrest. Robert Shelton, as we already mentioned, Imperial Wizard of the United Klans of America, insists in interview after interview that his order is not lawless, but patriotic, that it is dedicated to defending the American way of life from subversion. In an age when Americans are told that communists lurk in schools, unions, and even churches, this rhetoric allows the Klan to blur its violence with loyalty, its terror with patriotism, and its hooded mobs with national defense. Integration is the other pillar of the self-image as resistors. To them, desegregation is not just about schools or public accommodations, it is representative of the unraveling of the entire racial order that defines Southern society, at least according to them. The marches, sit-ins, and freedom rides of the civil rights movement provide the Klan with visible targets. Every time black demonstrators take to the street, the Klan claims it is responding to provocation, defending local communities from chaos, immorality, and disorder. Resistance becomes the Klan's word for maintaining white supremacy under the guise of protecting stability. On the other hand, in their own local rallies across the South, Klan preachers and stump speakers warm up their audiences not only by denouncing civil rights activists, but by invoking the name of Hitler and his lieutenants. Instead of treating Nazism as an enemy defeated in World War II, they reframe it as a model for how to deal with Jews and racial minorities. It was not uncommon to hear someone from the podium claim that Eichmann didn't really do it, and good for him if he did. Hitler had the right idea. Such statements are meant to provoke cheers, to present racial extermination as common sense rather than atrocity. This rhetoric also serves a practical purpose. It gives local Klansmen a sense of solidarity with one another as embattled defenders of Christian civilization. Whenever members are arrested for bombings, floggings, or intimidation, Klan speakers reframe them as martyrs. They tell crowds that these men are not criminals but victims of Jewish persecution, singled out by a system supposedly controlled by Jews and governments, the press, and the courts. By casting their own people as persecuted innocents, they turn legal investigations into further evidence of the conspiracy they claim to be fighting. Now that we stand in the middle of the Cold War, with airplanes capable of carrying bombs that can destroy whole cities and ideologies clashing across continents, the Klan wages its own war at home. The battle over integration is far from over, and neither are the nascent civil rights fighters defeated. The Klan swears to combat them both until the bitter end. It seeks not to defend liberty, but to smother it, not to preserve order, but to enforce submission. But for every burning cross, there is a rising voice. For every attempt at terror, an answer of courage. Their fire blazes not only on crosses, but in the hearts of those who fear the future. This culture war, ignited through populism, racism, and spiteful ideology, is consuming a nation which prides itself on pretty much the exact opposite: equality of opportunity, democracy, and the protection of constitutional rights. To see who comes out on top in this fight for the soul of a nation, stay with us here at TimeGhost. If you want to join the cause, go to timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Excelsior!